All right, last up, we have districting data. And we have a rather large number of presenters here, so I'll leave it to them to introduce themselves.
Okay, so I'm Ethan Bergmann. I'm a rising junior majoring in math and econ. I'm going to kind of introduce our project. Like they mentioned, we have a few different branches, but we're primarily Swarthmore students working on redistricting and gerrymandering across the United States under the guidance of faculty advisor Diana Davis.
So before we get started talking about each individual state, we want to introduce congressional seat apportionment and gerrymandering in general so that you have some basis to understand what we've been looking at. So after the census, every 10 years, congressional seats are reapportioned based on changes in population. So what this means is each state has a different number of representatives for the US House, and this changes every 10 years. So once each state receives however many representatives they'll have, then the people that are in power in that state redraw the maps. What this means is that incumbent politicians can increase their chances of re-election by gerrymandering, and the people in power have a better chance of getting re-elected. Minority groups might be muted because these people in power don't want their opposition to have as much of a voice. Sara? Okay, if she's not there. Gerrymandering is the manipulation of boundaries within state or congressional maps for purposes of partisan gain. There's different types of gerrymandering. Some are packing and cracking, which dilutes the power of opponents with their voting. And then constituents are sometimes misrepresented because of this, and opposition is muted. And you can see in the different graphs below how with the different spread of Republicans versus Democrats, how they result in different representation depending on how the districts are drawn. And because there are no detailed federal guidelines to prevent gerrymandering, it still often takes place in different states.
So I'm going to walk through the scales of political geometry. So at the smallest level, we have census blocks. So there's a large number of these across the country. This is a picture of New Hampshire. And as you can see, there's many, many census blocks, so much that it even becomes like a solid line down there in the southeast corner of New Hampshire. This is where kind of it all starts though. And then as we move on to block groups, this is the next step up. So the census does not take some specific information. It's not allowed to take some specific information for you. But there's another survey called the American Community Survey, and they can collect things such as income and education levels. And at that level is taken at the census block group, and we can use that data to do some initial analysis on our state. The most important scale of political geometry in our project overall is a precinct. It's a voting district made up of census blocks. So these are all the precincts in New Hampshire, and this is where the voting takes place, and it is where we get all the important information about the voting and where partisanship plays a role, and basically it's the foundation for all our work on gerrymandering. Then we have counties, which aren't as important in some states, but they are important in others. In general, we try not to split them up as far as like crossing county lines whenever drawing districts, and they have their own legislative power, but depending on the state, some are more powerful than others. And then finally, we have congressional districts. So New Hampshire only has 2 congressional districts shown here, and they attempt not to split the counties that were shown on the previous slide. And those congressional districts, each state has the power to draw their own congressional districts, which is where the problem of gerrymandering comes in.
So there are several ways to analyze gerrymandering and evaluate the fairness of the districts drawn. Partisan symmetry is one way. It is the principle that a particular share of votes received by a party should translate into a specific number of legislative seats, regardless of which party received that share of the total vote. So in the graph below, that shows that when Democrats receive 60% of the votes, they win 82% of the seats, while Democrats winning 40% of the votes translate to 18% of the legislative seats. This means that the partisan symmetry standard is met. Next slide. Another measure of partisan gerrymandering is the efficiency gap. This counts the number of votes each party wastes in an election to determine whether either party enjoyed a systematic advantage in turning votes into seats. Any vote cast for a losing candidate is considered wasted, as are all votes cast for a winning candidate in excess of the number needed to win. The efficiency gap is quantified by the equation total Democratic wasted votes minus total Republican wasted votes divided by the total number of votes. And this number will represent which party was better able to convert their votes into legislative seats. So for example, if the efficiency gap is 20%, would receive 20% more seats had both parties wasted an equal number of votes.
Can you hear this, or do I need to reshare?
District project, which allows the public to redistrict across the country. MDG has a lot of states, but we're trying to fill in the gaps with our work this summer. One state we're going to look at right now is Illinois, specifically Chicago.
We can't hear you good.
Yeah, if you could turn the sound up if that's possible, that'd be helpful.
Districtor, you can draw districts and kind of see how these different dynamics play out. So you can compare, there's an ideal population, so all districts.
I'll reshare it with sound, sorry.
Should be about this size. And then as we draw the districts, you can see how they compare to the overall population. Whether that be in demographics or voting age population, we can evaluate how they compare to the whole. Now, if we look at a finished project right here, this project has very low population difference, which is a good factor. It also has some majority black districts and districts which are close to the average of the whole city. Once we're done with that, we can click share on this distribution plan, and if we copy that, and we can come back to it later, but we can also share with policymakers or people in our community to show what a distribution plan might look like.
In order to create districts, we use GerryChain, which is a Python library created by MGGG. GerryChain uses a graph of the state in which each precinct is a node in the graph. You can think of it as a web where the intersections are a precinct and lines between those represent that the precincts share a border. It then runs a Markov chain to create new districts that meet the constraints that we code in, such as compactness or roughly equal population, and stores each possible redistricting plan. Data from each one can then be evaluated and compared to the current plan in order to measure its fairness. This GIF shows a collection of districts created by flipping boundaries between precincts in such a way that the population remained within 5% of the ideal population.
So our group focused on New Hampshire, and we'll get a little more into that. So New Hampshire has 2 congressional districts, and you can see the current ones shown in this graphic. So our data was pretty straightforward to get. We were lucky that New Hampshire has all of the shape files stored in the Granite website, their statewide GIS clearinghouse. So we were able to pull those from there. And then election data is all on New Hampshire's Secretary of State website, organized by precinct. And we were able to put all of that into a sheet and then use pandas and mop, two Python libraries, to merge our data and organize it the way that we would need to put it into our code.
Here's a video of Jerry Chain generating 1,000 possible districting plans. It starts with the districting plan that was created in 2011, and it's generating suggested districting plans for New Hampshire's 2 congressional districts. As opposed to the previous GIF, this one creates a new districting plan each time, independent of the previous one, and this one has constraints on its compactness, specifically on how many edges are cut when dividing the state into districts, where something with more cut edges will usually visibly look more gerrymandered. Making these independent districts is much better for comparing to the current plan, since they aren't related to each other in any way and are unbiased in their random nature.
So this is a box and whisker plot using our, so we used Jerry Chain to come up with an ensemble of possible plans. And then the red dot is the current plan, the 2011 plan, placed versus all those plans. So you can see the 2 New Hampshire districts, we call them District 0, District 1, both have about like 52% for District 0 and 54% for District 1 Democratic percent vote share in the 2016 presidential election. And we see that the 2011 plan follows the median of our ensemble pretty closely, which suggests that New Hampshire did not have anything specific that would suggest that it was gerrymandering the 2011 plan. Next slide.
We looked at using the 2016 presidential election data, Jerry Chains with that. So it created 1,000 different districts and measured for each whether 2 Republicans would win, 1 Republican and 1 Democrat, or 2 Democrats. So using this data, 920 of the times 1 person from each party won, and the other 80 times 2 Democrats won when looking at 2 congressional districts. So in the 2018 US House election, 2 Democrats actually won. So looking at this output, it seems that that would have been unlikely. So if people were voting along their partisan lines. So there's a large number of independents in New Hampshire, and part of this is due to the Free State Project, which recruits people, libertarians, to move to New Hampshire and bring their politics with them. So there's a huge percentage there of independent voters that swing election results because they're voting for a third party. So along with running the Democrat versus Republican Jerry Chains, we also ran Democrats versus Republicans plus independents. So if all of the independents suddenly decided that they wanted to vote Republican, and we also ran Democrats plus independents versus Republicans to see how much this really did influence elections. And in the Democrat versus Republican plus independent, 951 of the 1,000 districting plans had 2 Republicans winning, and the other 49 had 1 Republican and 1 Democrat, versus the other time Democrats plus independents versus Republicans, it was completely switched and had 978 times that 2 Democrats won versus only 22 times that 1 person from each party won. So you can see how much these libertarian voters really can swing these elections.
This is a population-weighted histogram of the vote share among precincts for the 2016 presidential election. So the height of these bars corresponds to how many people live in a precinct with that Democratic vote share. During this election, New Hampshire was skewed slightly Democratic, but there are actually more people who live in Republican favoring precincts. But since there are more highly Democratic precincts than highly Republican precincts, it was overall blue. These heavily Democratic precincts create the potential for districts to be packed with Democratic voters more easily than they can be packed with Republican voters, making it somewhat easier for Republican gerrymanders to create maps that benefit them.
So our next step is to first assess whether the current districts are fair. The district R tool doesn't cover some states, including New Hampshire, so we're gonna submit our data to help them add New Hampshire to the tool. We're also gonna look at the state house districts and measure the fairness of the new congressional redistricting plan after the census and contact representatives regarding that.
So that's everything. If anyone has any questions, or we can move on to the next state.
Any questions for any of our speakers, or should we just move? If not, we'll move on to the next section. Let's thank
Actually,
everyone that's presented so
We have
far.
questions for each one because there's so many presentations. I mean, there's 5 students on each presentation, so we might as well have a question.
Okay, so shall we save it to the end, Diana?
No, let's have them after each presentation.
Okay.
I was wondering why you chose New Hampshire.
We were assigned New Hampshire. So it was
That
a
works.
state that had few congressional districts. So it's something that wouldn't have as big of a population or as much data necessarily to work with. So it was a starting place.
Do you know if the parties themselves do these kinds of analyses also?
I didn't know.
Kind of curious if you knew how the Jerry chain, Markov chain kind of worked. What were the states, and kind of how does it update the system over time? If you could speak to a little bit of the mathematics there.
We haven't actually looked into that much. It's a lot of it is kind of hidden behind some functions in Python, but it would be interesting to look into the documentation to see if they have some information on that.
Cool, thank you.
There's actually, I can give you a short explanation about the mathematics behind jury chains. There are 2 methods. One of them is the recom method. The other is the random walk. And so in the recom method, basically the districts are the graph nodes, and we connect them. And if they are beside each other or something like that, and in each step of the Markov chain, you find the spanning tree and try to split it into 2 trees of the same size.
Thank you.
No problem.
All right, well, let's thank our speakers. So shall we move on to the next segment?
So I think Kansas might be the next group to go if other data districting REU people are okay with that.
Yeah, if that's okay with everybody, then I'll start sharing my screen, and Parker and I will talk about the sort of ongoing data collection process for the state of Kansas, which is what our team was working on. No, sorry. So this is the current map of Kansas. as we have it with all the data we've collected, although there are some empty spots on this map that have been filled by converting data that we've collected that wasn't in the previously talked about formats, and these formats are something that we'll go into later in our slide. But for now, Kansas is sort of an illustrative example of how the data collection can be more difficult. As you can see, Kansas has over 100 counties, which is one of the most in the nation. And being a more rural state, there have been rather more problems with data collection, as Parker and I will talk about later.
So just to give a brief overview of sort of how we approach this, in order to conduct the type of analysis that you saw during the New Hampshire portion, we have to take several different types of data and sort of combine them together in a way that the algorithm can handle. So in practical terms, this means using geographic information systems to combine several sources of data together. So GIS generically is used in a variety of contexts to combine spatial and geographic data into a single file for either analysis or further manipulation. So in our case, what we're trying to do is look at, on a precinct by precinct basis, what sort of demographics are we looking at in each precinct, and then mapping election returns onto each precinct so that for the whole state, we're able to look at sort of how many voters there are, which parties they correspond to, and then look at, for example, as you saw before, whether they're being packed or cracked in any way. So part of the thing that we had to do in order to build a data set that we can work with is to be able to, for the entire state, build a precinct level sort of map that contains all of the data we need. So up-to-date election information for several races and demographic information. So the most common format that you would use for GIS is ESRI shapefiles. Unfortunately, unless you have a central repository for the state like New Hampshire did, this information can be kind of hard to come by. So in the case of Kansas, unfortunately, they only have 2012 precinct data. So essentially, pretty soon after they conducted the census in 2010, they're required to report every 10 years, but that's not so useful to us given that many precincts' boundaries have changed since then. So in order to get more updated information, you sort of have to go through a more involved process. If you could go to the next slide, Theo.
Yeah.
So the initial goal in a project like this is to try and obtain a statewide map of precincts. So the census develops the Tiger Line program in order to aid analysis like this. Every time that there's a census, every 10 years or so, the census tries to integrate all of the information that it can into sort of a single shapefile at a number of different levels, including the statewide level. So for every state, and this includes Kansas, you can usually find sort of every 10 years, beginning in, I think, 2000, the file that contains sort of precincts and what's called voter tabulation districts. And so there are several different units on which votes are counted. So voter tabulation districts are the sort of census interfaced way of splitting up the precincts, essentially. So this allows you basically, and for some states, including Kansas, it does match up exactly to precincts. So this is sort of the way of getting a statewide file to look at. Unfortunately, 2012, as I mentioned earlier, is kind of old, but it does give a useful baseline. If we're able to match up the precinct names and the VTDs, which are unique identifiers, then we're able to see which counties have changed and then narrow down the list of counties to which we have to manually reach out in order to get new data. So I'll turn it over to you for the next slide, Theo.
Yeah, so considering Kansas has some of the most counties in the country, 108 to be exact, and their statewide shapefile was so old and in many places had changed, a large part of what we had to do was collect the data for ourselves county by county. So the first part of that process for us tended to be scouting and crawling through county websites, looking for their data, ideally in the form of a shapefile. More populous and wealthier counties tended to have a GIS office, or were more likely to have a GIS office, I should say. Tending to is a bit optimistic. But when they had a GIS office, it was more likely that they would have one of the shapefiles that we were looking for, or, and if that failed, then what we would do is emailing departments such as the county clerk or the county appraiser that might have the information that we were looking for. A lot of the time, this wasn't very successful, but when it was, we were able to simply download the shapefile ourselves, and then that county was done. And we could simply add that shapefile to the statewide shapefile that we've been compiling. If there wasn't that data, as was the case with many counties, then we would look for different contacts that we would find, such as a GIS coordinator, a county appraiser, or a county clerk, and then email them, which I'll get into our process for doing that now. So a really significant part of the work was simply just emailing various counties and county officials and following up with them to try and get the data that we were looking for. And this was difficult for a number of reasons, part of which was because a lot of the counties simply didn't have data in a shapefile format, such as .shp or another GIS format, such as maybe a Google Earth file. And frequently we got written descriptions of precincts as well as PDF maps of the precincts in an area. And those we had to convert into shapefiles ourselves, which I think the Nebraska group will be going into more detail on. This is the script that our group along with a lot of the students in our REU developed for contacting counties, and it was put together by I don't actually remember everyone's names off the top of my head, but it was a significant number of people. And the top right, it was something rather amusing that happened when a county official got kind of suspicious of the emails. So most of what we did was just emailing county officials. Well, not most of what we did, but a large part of what made the work slow is that a lot of times we had to just wait for county officials to get back to us. And in some cases they haven't, and we're still following up.
Yeah.
I'd actually like to ask Parker to talk about those.
So yeah, as you can tell, it's for at least states like Kansas that are not so well organized. A big portion of the project is just figuring out how to get all of the data together in one place and source it well. And so as you can understand, many of these county officials are not super responsive. Response rates were relatively low, often took 3 or 4 emails to get a response. So one of the barriers we ran into was the frequent need for open records requests. Under Kansas law, at least a lot of times for a private individual to be able to obtain this data, you have to go through, if you could go back one slide.
Oh, sorry.
Private individuals have to go through sort of a semi-elaborate process that involves filling out a form. So we ended up finding that in order to get data as efficiently as possible, we would have to sort of figure out whether they needed that and then fill it out in advance. That ended up slightly improving our response rate by reducing the need to send many emails. So now if you could go ahead to the next slide.
Yeah.
So those were our 2 main approaches, sort of figuring out how much we could get centrally, seeing if there was a central state file, and if not, whether we could use the out-of-date state file to form an exact match with precincts, as shown in this slide. Our colleague who wasn't able to be here today, Gwon, managed to build a spreadsheet tool that would take two separate files, election data and the precinct shape files from 2012 that we were given, and then match on VTDs and determine whether there were any discrepancies. Obviously, if there are no discrepancies, then it's safe to infer that they have not meaningfully changed since 2012, and we don't need to go out and get them. But in the case that there were discrepancies, and the case that they were not responding to our emails, which this was true of a number of counties, we had to develop a few further approaches. So our sort of main frontier approach at the moment is using private data sets, which is not the highest standard. We would look to get it from public sources, but in this case, we can use the same tool to compile, to check these most recently available privately compiled data sets against the precincts list from the 2018 election returns. So obviously there, if it matches up exactly, we can sort of infer that they are in fact correct and current, and we can proceed forward with using them. So this is sort of an overview of our data collection process, and that sort of sets the stage for other groups, which I think we'll talk more about how that data is cleaned and then used in the Jerry chain process.
Yeah, I would also like to add that this has sort of been, at least for us, we found that Kansas has been kind of an illustrative example of the difficulties of this kind of low-level data collection, as was emphasized to us by the people that we worked with at the MGGG, owing to the difference in data collecting practices across states and just the difference in data standards across states and across counties. Getting this kind of precinct level data can be really just kind of a slog, and this has definitely been an illustrative example of that. Yeah, are there any questions?
Let's thank our speakers.
I have probably too many questions to count, but so this is the data stuff that I work with all the time, and it's fascinating to watch y'all go through the process of actually obtaining it in places where I got completely stymied. I think I'll confine it to two questions. One is, what are you doing with this data? Because I want it. And two, how often do these, do you have any sense of how often the precinct boundaries change? Or even if and the corresponding one is if county boundaries ever change?
I think I can take that one. You may have something to add, Theo. In terms of sort of what we're doing with it in the documentation, I think we're working with the metric geometry and gerrymandering group over at Tufts, and I think we're hoping to release the data or as much documentation for it as we can find. So hopefully, if you wanted to work with it, we can sort of make it all of the state's data publicly available in one place so that you'd be able to work through with it. But in terms of getting, sorry, what was the second portion of your question again?
How often do precinct boundaries change and/or county boundaries?
Oh, yeah. So county boundaries do not change often, but precinct boundaries change somewhat often, I would say, depending on whether or not they contain or are adjacent to a big city. If you're outside a highly populated zone, the answer is not much at all. Many of the rural counties that we encountered didn't change at all from 2012 onward, but several counties that contained big cities within them, often precincts adjacent to those big cities, were changing quite often just because of underlying population shifts. I think that there's sort of a precinct boundary. You have to maintain rough balance between precincts, and so as you can imagine, there are pretty often population shifts within a city, and so that necessitates changing the precincts. And then often you'll have what's called annexations. So you'll bring in, as cities sort of expand over time, you'll create new precincts on land that formerly didn't have any voters in it. So the basic answer is, if you have a lot of voters, then it changes fairly frequently, or if it contains a big city. But if it's more rural, then it doesn't change all that often.
I'd also like to add a couple things. as Parker said, county boundaries don't really change except maybe during census redistricting, but for precinct changes, it can actually be kind of dependent on state law. For instance, there's an especial difficulty in getting precinct level data from California because their precincts change week by week as more and more people register to vote. And in Kansas, it can be not quite random, but difficult to figure out. And as to your question of what we hope to do with the data, once we get all of it, we also hope to, like the New Hampshire team, run jerry chains on it and and report back what the Kansas congressional districts, how they compare to other generated plans.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, let's thank Parker and Theo one more time.
All right, and now let's have Team Nebraska.
Would you like me to share my screen, or I'm not sure?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I'm Keegan. I'm one of the people who worked on Nebraska. Kevin and Alicia, you also want to introduce yourselves. And the names of our other group members are up on the screen for Nebraska.
Yeah, I'm Kevin. I'm a rising senior at SWAT, and I also worked with Keegan and Alicia and other people on the Nebraska team.
I'm Alicia. I'm pre-frosh, and I actually don't go to SWAT, but I worked on this project with my other team members.
Yeah, okay. I'm sorry I didn't mention before, I'm a rising senior also at Swarthmore. So digitizing maps, so I guess as was just talked about, you want to get a shapefile from a county when you're doing this, but oftentimes that isn't the case. So on this first slide, you can see that's just an image that some county in Nebraska, I think it's Oto County, sent, and it's just a PDF or JPEG, and we want it to be a shapefile, as you can, which is in the bottom right. It's just an image in here, but it has the spatial and location data along with it. So if you can go to the next slide. Yeah, so as was discussed before, some counties already have shapefiles, others will just send you kind of an image, but we really want to convert that into a shapefile. And that, in order to do that, we'll use software QGIS, which is you can use to manipulate those files, and then some plugins, which are labeled here, along with some other data sources. So I guess the three separate layers that we'll use is the census blocks, which was, as discussed before by the Kansas group, come from the Census Bureau, and they're really fine granular data, and we'll kind of use it as the building blocks. The OSM standard layer, which is kind of just like a base world map, which we can use to help translate between our image and the census blocks. And then also the precinct map, which in this case is just an image, so just a JPEG or PDF. And we'll kind of use all three of those together to kind of build the shapefile precincts using the census blocks.
So the first thing we really need to do is give a geographic context to all of our layers. So that's already done with the OSM standard map, because that's going to be our world map that QGIS provides. So the first thing we need to give context to is the census blocks. So if we just load our census blocks in, they just tend to load in randomly in the middle of our screen. If we overlay that on top of the OSM standard map, Nebraska tends to show up in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, which isn't very helpful. Luckily, census blocks come to us in a shapefile. And so one of the things that the shapefile gives to us is geographic information. So since we already have that, all we really need to do is give it a specific coordinate reference system, or a CRS. And once we align that correctly, we can see here that we can see our census blocks overlaid on top of our world map exactly where we want it to in the middle of the US. So now that we have given the context to the census block that we need, we can now filter out so that we only have the blocks that we need to work with. And so we generally go through this county by county, so we can just filter out for the county that we need using the unique FIPS code. And once we do that, we can move on to the next step of giving context to our precinct map. Next slide. So precinct maps are a lot less nice than our census blocks. So like Keegan said, these tend to be pictures, so PDF or JPEG, which have no geographic information tied to them. They're just colored pixels. So because of that, we need to manually georeference the points ourselves. And the way we do this is we identify points on our precinct map that are in the same location as points on our census map. And this is why it's really important to give geographic context to our census blocks, because the only way we can do this is by usually through identifying street intersections or other notable features like that, where we can accurately identify the same place on our precinct map and our census blocks. So usually we just need to do this for like 4 or 5 points on both maps, more if the county tends to be more irregularly shaped. And so once we do that, we can actually map our precinct blocks, our precinct map on top of our census blocks, kind of like you see on the screen there. And then once we do that, we can then move on to combining our census blocks into precincts.
So now that you have your georeference map, your map now has you have now kind of located where this PDF or JPEG map is supposed to go. And you're going to overlay that on top of your census blocks, which is shown on the image on the bottom right. You can kind of see the census blocks through the map. And our goal now is to combine the census blocks that are in the same precinct. And precincts in the maps are usually color-coded, so we can kind of use that and select kind of the polygon of census blocks that approximate the precinct borders. And after you do that, you're going to go around individually and select any of the tiny census blocks around the corners that you might have missed. And once you do that, you're going to merge your census blocks into a complete precinct. So from the previous slide to this side, you can see that the green precinct kind of on the top left corner has been merged into one block. And after this, you're going to rename that precinct according to the name that the map gives. And you're going to repeat this process for every single precinct on your map. And after you're done, a lot of times, since the census blocks are so small, you'll have missed a few in the corners or along the edges of your precinct. And you can use what's called an attribute table in QGIS, which kind of lists every single block on your in this section of census blocks, and it tells you kind of which blocks are merged and which blocks, small blocks, are still individual pieces that you need to merge with a larger precinct. And after you do this for every single precinct, you can export this file as a QGIS layer style file, and that gives you your complete precinct map. So if we go through the sequence, you start with your group of census blocks. This is from Otoe County, Nebraska. And then you merge each precinct into their blocks, which gives you a final digitized map of Otoe County. And as you can see, the precincts on the right, on the bottom right, match with the map, the original PDF map that we are given on the left. And that is essentially how you digitize counties. Does anyone have any questions?
Let's thank our speakers. Any questions?
Oh, I guess before we go on, one thing I want to also mention is, as Kevin was saying, you use reference points on both the image you're given, plus in the real world map to the kind of place where it's supposed to go. But one thing is important to mention is that they were told not to use water, like a river or something, as a reference point, because over time rivers can move. I know in Nebraska in particular, in a lot of places along big rivers, pieces, chunks, the river moves and then chunks of one state end up on the opposite side of the river. So it can be easy to mess up if you use that.
Makes sense. Thanks, Keegan.
I guess one thing I can, sorry, I can add to that is that sometimes the PDF maps don't include street names. As you can actually see for the Otoe County one, there's no street names and there's kind of none of the standard reference points we use. So a lot of the times we have to resort to using the edges of the county or the county corners and the boundaries, as well as some of the edge points on the city here instead of our usual street intersection.
All right, let's thank our speakers one more time. Let's move on to the next exciting part.
Hi, I'm Katie Knox, and I'll be talking about how we join shapefile with demographic and election data using some quirky examples from Maine, and I believe also Jorge and Nathan are speaking with me today. Nathan?
Can you go back a slide?
Oh, sure. There you go.
Thank you. So you've already heard a couple of ways to get precinct data, so I'm gonna kind of speed through it. Our process matches most closely with New Hampshire's, where it was easily available online from Maine's GIS office. But what's different about Maine is that each town has its own precinct. So you see a lot of square, small ones, especially in the north of the state. And a lot of those have small or no population. But since we're talking about joining data, I want to emphasize, and you can see on the figure, that the census blocks, which is where demographic data comes from, don't always align perfectly with these precincts, with these towns. And so joining that data might not be quite so straightforward as it was with other states.
Yeah, so like our most problematic step in this kind of process that all the other states have talked about at length was finding and cleaning election data because as we mentioned, Maine reports election data by precinct, but precincts are also towns. But sometimes there's discrepancies from one election to the next. So it just involved a lot of like decision making and yeah, to kind of like aggregate the data and create one standardized unit of voting reporting that we can use for analysis.
All right, and so eventually we did find that had all of the precincts for Maine, which was great, except that it didn't match the format that we had our election data in. So for our election data, some precincts reported their votes independently, while others reported them with neighboring precincts. Usually those with like fewer votes or like a smaller population reported it with the neighboring precincts. And so in order to match the format with our shapefile and our election entries, I went in and just kind of joined the shapes of each of the precincts in the shapefile. So like as you can see from like the left image to the right image, what was once individual squares now become like this L shape, as like I started merging the precincts to keep that like 1-to-1 ratio with the election entries and the precincts in the shapefile. Oh, next slide.
Next one.
So now that we have the election results merged with the precincts, we wanted to add more data to it, and this time it was the demographic data. So this was actually more accessible than the election data because we didn't have to go hunting for it. The demographic data is released by the census every 10 years on this website, NHGIS, and it's like open source, so you can just like go in and request the data. So yeah, once we had the data, we were able to combine it with our shapefile that had our election results. So here we show you like a little graphic of what each step looked like. So if you look at the purple image in the top left and the table beside it, this was the original shapefile that we had to work with. We're focusing in on the precinct of Augusta, which is the capital of Maine. And you can see that in the table, there's no data with it. It just has the name of the township. And so with the next step, the table right beside it, we went in and added the election data. So you can see here we have like Pres 16R, which is the Republican votes for the 2016 presidential election. And just like a lot more information with that. And now we have like the shapefile that we got from the census, which are like the census blocks. And as you can see, it is not as pretty as our purple precincts in the top left. This is a lot more complex. So we were once focusing on the entire township of Augusta, we are now focusing on one block in Augusta. Since Augusta is made up of multiple blocks, you can't just focus on all of them at once. So here we see in this one block in Augusta, we have a number, like we have information for the total population, if they, how many have like Hispanic origins, their race, and the voter age population in that block. So this was cool. This was the information that we wanted. And then finally, with our last step, we were able to join it with our election data and have our election data and our demographics all in the same shapefile. Next slide. All right, so our process was not as smooth and clean as we're presenting to you. Essentially, between each step of aggregating data to the shapefile, we ran into some problems. Usually with like duplicates in our data or some entries missing, because a huge portion of Maine actually is uninhabited. There's like a lot of conserved land there. But the main issue that we ran into was Piscataquis County Island, which was just free floating in the middle of Maine. So like, as you can see, there's like this huge lake in Maine, and in the middle of the lake, there's Piscataquis County Island. And usually islands aren't that big of a problem. There are a ton of islands along like the southern coast of Maine. However, along like the southern coast of Maine, usually like the adjacent precincts claim the area of water. However, with this lake, no one claimed the area of water, yet there was still like a precinct in there. So it just caused errors in our code when we were trying to analyze it, since there was nothing adjacent to it. To go about this, we ended up having to contact MGGG, which is an organization that focuses on doing a lot of this work. And they knew a cool little code that was able to like tack on that precinct to an adjacent precinct.
Yeah, and so finally we've been able to get our data to a point where we can run Jerry Chain. And New Hampshire definitely explained this process more in detail. And yeah, so the preliminary results that we're getting have been a bit interesting, just because Maine is so largely uninhabited, and a lot of, there's a bit of a problem I think we're seeing with using election results in Maine as a proxy for partisanship, because it seems that like a lot of the elections are more personality based. Like for instance, the senator Susan Collins has been an incumbent since 1997, and so it's like our data is not as trustworthy as we want it, and so that kind of explains this box plot here. After running Jerry Chain and over like an ensemble of 100,000 maps, we have District 0, which would be the district with the fewest amount of Democratic vote shares, and it's still above 0.5. So this graph is essentially saying that like over 100,000 potential hypothetical maps based on presidential election data from 2012 only this many maps would even guarantee one Republican representative. And yeah, so that may be given that there is a Republican representative in Maine, that might be more of a flaw with our data. So basically the overall goal with our process is to be able to create more histograms and box plots and be ready for 2021 redistricting, and be able to say like immediately identify if a map is an outlier, if it looks jerry chained according to a large ensemble of maps. Thank you so much. Are there any questions?
Let's thank our speakers. We have time for maybe one quick question, if anyone has one.
I have a sort of general question. Honestly, anyone could answer this problem from any of the groups, but it's more on like, imagine districts are evenly just formed randomly and they're all kind of like similar to Kansas, like they all just seem to be squares, but the result that comes out of it seems gerrymandered. Would you consider that gerrymandering, even if it seems to be random and unintentional, or would that be? Yeah,
that's a really good question. I just think it's a really interesting question, just because yes, what looks visually gerrymandered is not always like gerrymandered in that sense. Like we get our notion of gerrymandering a lot from like maps that look visually off, but basically like people who are creating the districts also have similar tools to what we're using, probably even better tools, and are able to create maps that don't look gerrymandered but are effectively partisanly gerrymandered. So that's why we're trying to use measures like the mean median measure and the efficiency gap, and none of these measures are perfect in and of themselves. They have like these mathematical flaws, which I think Parker posted a paper that gets into that more in detail. But we can, over an ensemble of maps, we can kind of get an idea of where roughly the average should lie. So it's more like using an outlier. It's showing that a graph is an outlier, even if like, because of geographic, because for instance, Democrats are usually in highly dense urban areas, and so that makes it harder for Democrats to have a majority across a whole state. So like issues like this make it harder to kind of visually identify gerrymandering, if that answers your question.
I think a little bit more context for that, just based on historical knowledge of gerrymandering. We actually just don't have a set idea of what correct districting looks like. Nobody ever defined like, hey, this is what a district should be. And so we've been debating amongst ourselves of what is a gerrymandered district? Well, against what? Like, what is it supposed to be? And we have some ideas of what are really wrong, but I don't think but we still haven't yet gotten an idea of what's really right.
All right, let's thank our speakers one more time. And now to our last group.
Cool. I will be sharing screen. If I can find the screen. Okay. Cool. So, so our project is like an offshoot of the Districting Data REU, but focused more on prison gerrymandering, specifically in Pennsylvania. And so a bit of background about prison gerrymandering. The definition is that is the practice of counting incarcerated individuals as residents in the district of their correctional facility rather than their actual place of residence, which sounds innocuous enough, but actually impacts the way in which voting districts are drawn and consequently the voting power of a given district. And so while the census has evolved to accommodate other unconventional living situations like
students or military personnel serving abroad, they count prisoners who are also non-voters, like in a pretty archaic way that actually dates back to Jim Crow. And so this is a super important issue that we should care about because of the systemic racism, and also because it does affect Philadelphia and Pennsylvania quite drastically, given that Philadelphia has the second highest incarceration rate of any major city in the US, and that's pretty local to Swarthmore. And so given that, I think it's something that we should be addressing and that we should care about.
So there have been two separate movements within the Philly and Pennsylvania area to try and collect home addresses of incarcerated individuals to correct the data statewide and undo that kind of gerrymandering to accurately reflect incarcerated populations and guarantee a fair and equal representation for every citizen. But neither of these have been successful, and the most recent one will probably be tabled yet again for the 2020 census. And the growing prison population has made it such that the population in prison is large enough to affect legislative districting. So you can see on the right, the graphic, which was published by the Bear Institute of Justice, shows that the prison and jail population in Pennsylvania has increased and almost quadrupled between 1983 and 2015. And according to the Prison Policy Initiative, 40% of the state's prisoners are from urban Philadelphia, and all of them are incarcerated outside the city in often very remote locations. So you can see how this has can have a dramatic impact on legislative districting. And there are counties in Pennsylvania, like Union County, for example, where an eighth of the reported census residents are actually incarcerated in prisons there. So they can't vote, but they can dramatically impact, how the districts are drawn.
So there are three primary political issues associated with prison gerrymandering. There's representation and funding, there's district population legality, and there's partisan bias. So I'm going to start with representation. Prison gerrymandering makes rural votes count more in a sentence, which conflicts with one person, one vote. To understand why, imagine the simplest case. You have two districts which are the same in every way. They have the same population, they have the same 50% voting age population, so 30,000 people who are old enough to vote, the same demographics, everything. Except that in District 1, 1,000 of those 60,000 are incarcerated and unable to vote. And in District 2, there are actually 1,000 extra adults who live there, but they're incarcerated in District 1. So already District 1 has 29,000 people voting for an official population of 60,000, except it's really a population of 59,000 residents. And District 2 has 30,000 people voting for what in reality is 61,000 residents. So clearly representation is a little bit off. In addition to the representational issue, funding is allocated based on population. So even though District 2 has 2,000 more people than District 1, they'll get the same funding. But factor in the rest of the reality. We're looking at state house districts because they have the lowest population of state or federal districts, and so therefore they could be affected the most by residents being counted at their prison. There are 203 of these districts, which alone makes the differences in shifted population far more complicated than the two-district toy model you just saw. So issues like demographics also complicate the shift in power. This is a map with all of the state and federal correctional facilities on it. And then there are red X's where Pennsylvania's 5 largest cities are. So you can already see that none of the prisons are really anywhere close to the cities. And now it's overlaid with a map that shows Pennsylvania's Black population by precinct. The darker parts of the map represent a higher percentage of total Black population. And you can see that most of the prisons are in precincts that look like they have almost no Black people. There are a few, like if you look at the gray circle on the north of the map, that's a federal prison, FCI McKean, which seems like it's in a precinct with more Black population, but that's only because 2/3 of the 2,350 people who live there are incarcerated. So clearly the rural location of prisons cause a shift of power from Black and brown, usually urban communities, to rural white communities.
Okay, so to run this analysis that we wanted to do, we needed data to help us relocate incarcerated persons to the residential district where they are currently not counted towards the population. We also needed information on where the prisons are to see where prisoners are currently being counted. That way we could quantify the extent to which districts and the results of elections in those districts may change if we count incarcerated people towards their home precinct. So to get data on both prisons and the incarcerated people in them, I went to the Pennsylvania DOC. They have a searchable database, which you can see on the right, with each inmate's name, location, race, and the county in which they committed their crime, which we're using as a proxy for their home county. On the left, you can see an example of the data that appears when you search that. But this database had a bunch of problems that made it impossible to scrape, including like limits on search results, and also that we couldn't find the data source. It's well protected, which makes sense. It also only has data for state correctional institutions and does not include data from federal correctional facilities because they are not under the jurisdiction of the PADOC. So I reached out to the DOC to request these complete data for state facilities under information laws in Pennsylvania, but I'm still waiting on a response from them. So in the meantime, I manually copy pasted inmate data using filters and different sorting methods to grab as many as possible. And I later imputed missing data to, in the end, come up with over 40,000 incarcerated persons from long-term state prisons. So once we combined that with the locations of the prisons, we had the two very important pieces of information that we needed, which is where incarcerated individuals are from, presumably, and where they're living now. So the map that you're about to see, that you already kind of saw, shows all the precincts in Pennsylvania colored by the amount of people that we need to either add or subtract from the counts. In other words, the amount that are missing because they're in state correctional institutions. So red and orange precincts, you can see, contain the state correctional facilities, and green or blue precincts are estimated to be missing between 5 and 40 people. As you can see, much of the state's precincts are colored green or blue, which signals just how many of these precincts are affected when we consolidate their populations into these precincts with prisons. Precincts which, if you remember the map from earlier, are mostly rural. So on the precinct level, this doesn't really seem like much, between 5 and 40 people, but there are over 9,000 precincts in Pennsylvania. You can see a close-up of the Philadelphia region as well. So when we are going to aggregate into districts and congressional districts, we'll see much bigger effects, as we'll explain.
So that brings us nicely to the second main issue, which is legality of the actual sizes of the districts. If you move all of the incarcerated people back into their home districts, but keep the districts the same size, you can find issues with the size. And a 2018 study by 2 Villanova professors found that if you do this, there are in fact 4 districts that are actually legally too large and 4 districts that are legally too small. We put pluses on the ones that would be too large, so too many people coming back into their residential district, and minuses on the ones that are too small. And you can see that 3 of the 4 districts that would be too large are clustered in North Philly. And so that kind of emphasizes the point from earlier that it's really taking political power away from urban communities.
So some of the other prison gerrymandering issues we discussed assess individual districts and how they're affected by prison gerrymandering. What we used Jerry Chain for was to look at its effect on the entire legislature and whether it can cause one party to gain extra seats. So we used Jerry Chain to generate a sample of plans following state redistricting rules. It's similar to what each of the state groups were doing that you've already heard, where they were comparing one plan to a full sample of multiple plans. But where our research kind of diverged is we were interested in how 2 samples would compare to each other. So with the data that Madeleine collected on incarcerated people in Pennsylvania, we made a copy of Pennsylvania's district population data that reflects incarcerated people being placed back at their residential address, which you can see listed in the figure is adjusted. And we ran it with the normal data from the US Census Bureau, which is unadjusted. And you can see different iterations of Jerry chains. And you can see they start out the same, but after 500 iterations and then 1,000 iterations, they diverge. And ideally, we would run more iterations to actually get a better sense of exactly what happens. But using this data, we were able to create a histogram, or two histograms, and overlay them. One with prison gerrymandering, which in this case is yellow, and one modified to exclude it, which is the blue, to see whether there's a shift in the number of Republican won seats due to prison gerrymandering. So we can see that there is a noticeable difference, but because we haven't accounted for certain districting rules, like some of the, as we talked about earlier, some of the districts being too large or too small, and because we haven't run as many iterations as we would like and factored in some, like for one example is we had to set the tolerance up to 2% for jerry chains when legally it should be, or sorry, 20% to start when legally it should be 5%, just because some of the districts starting out are starting out already not legal. So we would like to run to more analysis on the data, but so far it does look like there is a difference, but we're not sure whether this will be the a mirror of the actual difference.
Cool. So as far as immediate next steps, we've yet to integrate data from federal prisons into this analysis, so that might shake things up a bit. But then our also overarching goal for the end of the summer is just to be able to develop findings that are publishable, so as to like raise more awareness about this issue. Prison gerrymandering is still legal in all but 9 states in the US, with a lot of recent movement in states like Virginia to pass state legislation that bans it. And so reaching out to colleagues out in states that have been able to put an end to prison gerrymandering could also just be another level of advocacy moving forward. And that's it.
All right, let's thank our speakers. Any questions? All right, so if there are no other questions, let me thank all of you for coming, and let's thank all of our researchers for their stellar work all summer one last time.